In the space of just a month, we saw the price of wheat shoot up by 60%. And so by August last year, we were seeing demonstrations in Mozambique about high food prices. And, you know, in the months following, we saw high food prices as a sort of contribution to some of the uprisings in the Middle East. Now, this sudden increase in the price of wheat was blamed on droughts in Russia, which did happen. They obviously affected the harvest of wheat in Russia, and they also contributed to wildfires, which destroyed some of the crops. So you might think, well, you know, that explains it. You know, that less supply coming onto the market, you would expect, you know, following market economics, for the price of wheat to go up. But what's missing from that explanation is actually the fact that globally, we were having a bumper wheat harvest. The US, in particular, was seeing really high yields. And in fact, globally, we saw the third highest wheat harvest on record. So actually, with the full facts there about what was happening in the market, that doesn't explain at all why we saw this sudden peak. And the reason for this sudden increase lies in speculation. So financial speculators, banks, hedge funds, other financial institutions saw what was happening in Russia, thought, aha, food prices are going to go up. Let's put our money into this. We can make some profit out of rising prices. And this was the same thing that happened back in 2007, 2008, where you know, some sort of fundamental factors in the market saw food prices increasing, and speculators jumped into the market and exacerbated those increases. So it's, you know, it's the sort of second or third spike we've seen in the last 5 or so years. And there's a graph here which covers the last 20 odd years. You can see obviously there are fluctuations in food prices, but this is the spike in 2007, 2008, where we saw the real global food crisis and riots, demonstrations around the world about the price of food. Then we've got a spike here in 2010. So this is for all food. The wheat spike was sort of not seen in all of the food stuff. So in general, the spike isn't as high because it just was in wheat. And then this is what's happened recently. So we've seen food prices actually rise above the level they were at in the food crisis of 2007 and 2008. So pretty scary stuff, and it very much looks like that the 2007-2008 food crisis was not a one-off, and it's something that we're going to be seeing again. In the UK and other countries in the developed world, people typically spend 10 to 15% of their income on food. In the global south, in developing countries, the poor are spending anything between 50 and 90% of their income on food. So you can see how, you know, a 60 to 90% increase in the price of food is going to have a devastating impact. Now, to sort of understand why financial speculation is contributing to this problem, it's useful to kind of know a bit of history. So if we go back to the US in the 1800s, and futures contracts were developed, and the idea was that it allowed producers and big purchasers of food and other commodities to have some certainty. So a farmer, perhaps planting in the spring, would want to know that once he or she had produced, let's say, a ton of wheat, that they could get a guaranteed price for this crop. So they would set up a futures contract, which was basically a promise to pay, say, in 6 months' time, X amount of wheat for a particular price. And likewise, that could also benefit the buyers, so perhaps a miller or a baker wanted to know that, you know, they weren't suddenly going to have the problem of the price of flour doubling. So it could work the other way, that they would purchase a contract to receive a set quantity of flour or wheat or whatever it was at a particular price. So it was really it was a form of insurance, effectively, to give people in these markets certainty. Now, by the 1900s, we'd seen banks and other speculators entering these markets, not really interested in what the actual physical commodities were being bought and sold for, but basically using these markets to make a profit. So banking on the price going up and then being able to pocket the difference. between the original price on the futures contract and the actual price at that time, or vice versa. And so by the time of the Wall Street crash in the 1930s and the financial regulation that came along after that, this kind of speculation was really clamped down on, and there were regulations specifically put in place to avoid excessive speculation in these markets. Now that regulation actually stayed in place until the 1990s, really quite recently, when lobbying by some of the big banks, Goldman Sachs and others, weakened this regulation, which had been in place for decades. And as a result, we've seen a huge increase in these number of futures contracts, something like a 500% increase between 2002 and 2008. And also the development of more complicated futures type contracts called derivatives, which I won't go into detail about here, but that's probably enough to kind of understand the basic issue. And really what we've seen in the last sort of 10 to 15 years is a huge increase in the amounts of money going into these futures and other derivatives markets, and amplifying the sort of natural fluctuations in these markets, and leading to these huge spikes and then crashes as well. And there's an increasing body of evidence and sort of international consensus around this. So one question that often comes up is, okay, well, you've got this market in these futures contracts and other derivatives, but how does that actually affect the price of the physical goods being traded? Because you've really got two different markets here. So there's one, the buying and selling of the physical goods. There's another, trading in basically paper, or even, well, now it's electronically. And if I can just give an example which might sort of explain how the two markets are linked and how one can impact on the other. If we imagine that I'm a farmer and I've got a ton of wheat to sell, and the current price of wheat, let's say, is £100 a tonne. Now, if I look to the futures market and see that I could sell a futures contract for my tonne of wheat, say in 3 months' time, for £200, I might think, well, actually, if I possibly can, I'm going to hold on to my wheat for now, because in 3 months' time, I'll be able to sell it for more. So if I was to do that, I'd be keeping my wheat off the market, restricting the supply, and that would mean there was less wheat on the market and prices would go up. Otherwise, I might say, well, okay, I'm happy to sell it now, but you're going to have to give me a bit more than £100 for it, because otherwise I won't sell it. So either way, you can see how that's causing the current price of the physical goods to go up. A lot of the trading in these derivative contracts we actually don't know very much about. A lot of them are traded what's called over the counter. It really should be under the counter. So it's trading that takes place between just two parties, perhaps a bank and its clients. Nobody else knows about that. So the first problem is that we actually don't know completely what's going on in these markets. So we need trading to be brought onto regulated public exchanges so that we know exactly what is going on. So the stock exchange is an example of an exchange. Trading quite happily carries on the stock exchange. So this isn't, a crazy idea that a load of hippies have come up with. This is a well-established kind of mechanism for this kind of trading. And the second thing is what we call position limits. So it's basically a measure to limit the amount of contracts that banks and other financial institutions can hold. So it's not calling for a complete ban on these. Actually, a little bit of the kind of non-commercial actors being involved in the markets is useful. It does kind of transfer the risk from the people who are actually buying and selling these things to people who are prepared to take the risk. But it's the volume of the speculation we've been seeing in recent years that is what's really problematic.